very good evening to one and all. Welcome to the fourth lecture in what I call the Bilahari series.
Oh, please.
A very influential public intellectual, and at a personal level, I've known him for more than 40 years. This evening, he's going to speak on, as the topic is in front, new global and regional strategic context. So without further ado and with much anticipation, let's welcome Bilahari Kausikan.
I said I took some liberties with the topic, but I will be speaking about the strategic environment, which today, and I think going forward increasingly so, is going to be largely shaped and defined by US-China relations. Now, that relationship is today in a state of more than usual uncertainty is obvious, and perhaps so obvious that some of you may think that there is already not very much more to say, because almost every day there are any number of commentaries on US-China relations. If you want to look for them, you can spend the entire day, the entire week reading about US-China relations and nothing else. And it'll make for quite a full day. So to try to avoid boring you, let me begin with a story. And I told you I'm taking some liberties with this topic. Now, once upon a time, there was an American president who one summer's day, with a stroke of his pen, and with no prior consultation with America's allies, destroyed an almost 30-year-old international order that America had itself created and from which it had greatly benefited. The name of that president was not Donald Trump, but Richard Nixon. The international order that he ended was the 1944 Bretton Woods system, the central pillar of which was the link of the US dollar to gold, which Nixon completely severed unilaterally on 15 August 1971. My point is that putting America first and acting unilaterally are not inventions of Mr. Trump. 6 months later, on 21st February 1972, Nixon again shocked American allies by visiting China and re-establishing a relationship that had been characterized by more than 2 decades of hostility. Japan was particularly unsettled and scrambled to adjust. My point is not that Trump has not been disruptive. He certainly has. But has he been unusually disruptive? That is not a question, at least unusually disruptive in foreign policy. That is not a question that has a straightforward answer. Arguably, there is nothing that Trump has done, at least so far, that has been quite as destructive of international order as George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq in 2003. That invasion severely strained the transatlantic alliance and shattered the Middle East as we know it, as we had known it since the end of the First World War. The Middle East cannot be put together again in the same way. The transatlantic alliance has, to my mind, not yet entirely recovered. At least the same level of trust is no longer there, and it's not all just because of Mr. Trump. So the implications of that invasion are still reverberating globally and will do so, in my view, for many, many more years to come. So Trump is as much a symptom as a cause of the resulting flux and fragility in international order. He may have amplified the uncertainties, but he did not cause them. His election in 2016 was certainly unexpected. That again is obvious. But my general point in telling you all these things, and beginning by telling you all these things, is that far too much analysis of international relations, whether by academics, certainly by foreign ministries, and definitely by journalists, far too much of their analysis of international relations focuses on events, such as Trump's election, the shock of which has yet to subside, and not enough on the processes in which particular events are necessarily embedded. Insufficient focus on processes distorts our understanding of events. Now, the sense of perspective that a focus on processes brings to our understanding of international relations is particularly crucial when we consider the most significant geopolitical development of the late 20th century and early 21st century, which is, of course, China's rise and its corollary, the relative decline of the US. And I stress the term relative. Accurate understanding is crucial because the basic strategic challenge for all other countries is how to position ourselves as the US and China grope towards a new modus vivendi. This challenge will preoccupy us for decades to come. A new modus vivendi is not going to be established next week or next year or even in the next few years. I think it's going to be a constant preoccupation of these two countries and hence of the rest of us for many decades. Now, without accurate understanding, the risk of miscalculation, mispositioning, or being ambushed by events rises. Trump's election is one example of being ambushed by events. China's rise is a term far more often loosely bandied about than precisely defined or even understood. In fact, it's a trope. Now, a trope is not inaccurate. China's reemergence as a major regional and global actor is a geopolitical fact that cannot be denied. A trope is not inaccurate, but it is an overused but under-examined term. Something of a cliche, actually. China's rise is usually described by a simplistic and misleading narrative. Misleading because it is simplistic. And a trope can be dangerous, can have dangerous strategic consequences. I'll deal with those consequences of, misunderstanding, oversimplifying international developments using tropes as a mode of analysis in my last lecture, the next lecture. For now, let me just try in this lecture to inject some complexity into our understanding of the term China's rise and its corollary, America's relative decline. Now, China's rise is both a symptom and consequence of a far broader and more complex reorientation of international order. For those of us born in the 1950s and 1960s or earlier, the most important geopolitical event of our adult lives, at least of my adult life, was the end of the Cold War. In a historical instant, and miraculously without much bloodshed, the international structure that directly or indirectly, and irrespective of whether or not we were conscious of it, had shaped almost every facet of our lives for decades, suddenly dissolved. What will replace it is not yet entirely clear, although we are beginning to be able to glimpse its outlines. Despite its many dangers, the Cold War international order was clear and simple, essentially binary in structure. You were either on one side or another. Even if you tried to be or pretended to be non-aligned, you essentially defined your interests in relation to this binary structure. This entrenched a mode of thought, a binary view of the world that is still a powerful, albeit usually unconscious, but certainly inappropriate, influence on how we understand the trope of China's rise. To state my argument up front, China's rise is not necessarily America's decline, except in relative terms. There are trajectories, Chinese trajectory and the US trajectory. Their trajectories will not unfold in straight lines, either up or down, and are not to be understood in any teleological manner. Quite a lot of commentary on China is what somebody else in a different context called a Whiggish view of history, up and on and on. The post-Cold War is complex, not binary. And after the Cold War, all major power relationships, whether we describe those relationships as between allies, between partners, or between competitors, are no longer binary, no longer only one thing or another. You just think about it. Think about, say, Japan-US relations. Think about Japan-Russia relations. Think about Russia-Europe relations, China-India, any combination you care for. You're no longer only one thing or the other. And US-China relations are certainly no exception. Freed of the constraints of US-Soviet and Sino-Soviet competition, the US and China are now able to pursue their own interests assertively. The US and China are not natural partners, but neither are they inevitable enemies. I really dislike that book, a very stupid book written by an otherwise very intelligent man, Mr. Graham Allison, The Thucydides Trap. It's a very silly book. US-China relations are inextricably entangled in a way that US-Soviet relations never were. The Soviet Union was containable because it very largely contained itself by pursuing autarky. The US and the Soviet Union interacted only tangentially. Their relationship was structured primarily by the need to avoid mutual destruction. Unlike the Soviet Union, China is an irreplaceable node in the global economy, as vital as the American economy. US-China relations are simultaneously interdependent in a way that is historically unique between major powers and simultaneously infused with deep strategic mistrust. And in fact, interdependence enhances mistrust by exposing mutual vulnerabilities. US-China relations are thus characterized by a profound ambivalence, as are in different degrees all other major power relationships. Neither the US nor China find their ambivalent relationship comfortable. The Trump administration's approach towards trade with China, his so-called trade war, and I use the term so-called because trade is only the instrument, the objective is strategic competition, reflects this discomfort. So too does Xi Jinping's attempt to find an alternative to interdependence with the US through his signature Belt and Road Initiative, the ultimate purpose of which is also strategic competition. Neither the US nor China are likely to succeed in entirety. At least that's my view. Now, the so-called liberal international order, this time I say so-called because it wasn't really very liberal with those who disagreed with it. Anyway, the liberal international order is not the natural or only possible international order. Since the 18th century, when Europe competed to carve up the globe into colonies, and more starkly after the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, international order has normally been divided between competing systems. It was only for a very brief period, brief viewed in the sweep of history, between around 1991, when the Soviet Union imploded, and around 2009, when the global financial crisis broke out, that the American-led liberal international order seemed unchallenged and unassailable. Now, the universality of the American system, particularly in its political aspects, was always a delusion. But America's openness and the generosity impelled by the imperatives of the Cold War allowed variants of its economic aspects, and China, after Deng Xiaoping's reforms, is itself an example, allowed variants of its economic aspects to develop around the world and attach themselves to the US. Globalization was the name by which we came to describe this process after the Cold War. But that process carried within itself the seeds of its own erosion, even as it seemed to stand alone. The Trump administration, like the Obama administration, is a reaction to the hubris that contaminated American policy after the Cold War. Without the balance imposed by the Soviet alternative, the American idea was taken to extremes. When taken to extremes, even the worthiest idea becomes self-subverting. Globalization's liabilities were downplayed, even as Western democratic ideals taken to extremes degraded the ability of Western political systems to deal with them. Hubris drew the US into interminable wars in the Middle East, leading to public disillusionment with the traditional political establishment and traditional values. Without the existential challenges of the Cold War, why should Americans bear any burden or pay any price to maintain international order, particularly when order has proven elusive as it has in the Middle East? Not just the Middle East, but particularly the Middle East. So it's time to put one's own house in order. When Obama successfully campaigned on the slogan of change, he was not, to my mind, primarily speaking about change abroad, but change at home. In other words, about putting America first. Obama and Trump are different iterations of the post-Cold War metamorphosis of American values. There are similarities concealed by Obama's smooth fluency and Trump's penchant for exaggerated and flamboyant expression. Let me give you an example. Both Obama and Trump have sought to spread the burdens of leadership. This has in fact been a goal of American policy since the late 1960s. There is an essential continuity between Nixon's Guam Doctrine of 1969, which put American friends and allies in East Asia on notice that they would henceforth have to take more responsibility for their own defense, through Jimmy Carter's unsuccessful attempts to scale back the US military presence in East Asia, to Reagan's also ultimately unsuccessful efforts to get European members of NATO to shoulder more of the burdens of transatlantic defense, to Obama's emphasis on multilateralism. Multilateralism is a way of spreading the burden, at least the political burden, and in some cases the material burden. Well, there's a line connecting Obama's emphasis on multilateralism to Trump's heavy-handed threats and bilateral pressures on Europe and East Asia. The George H.W. Bush, Clinton, and George W. Bush administrations, which coincided with the hubris of the unipolar moment in American foreign policy, marked a pause in the pursuit of burden sharing, not a change of direction. And despite his proclamation of a new world order under American leadership, Bush 41, the elder Bush, was acutely aware of the limits of American power and cautious in its deployment without international support. For example, being careful to seek UN endorsement before deploying force to evict Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. Another example is when he visited Moscow and flew straight to Kiev to warn the Rada, the European Parliament, not to pursue suicidal nationalism, for which he was derided as chicken Kiev. But I think he was right. Look what happened subsequently. Multilateralism may be the more internationally acceptable method, and one may well debate the effectiveness of different methods, but there has been an essential continuity in the goal of burden sharing. In fact, again, arguably, Trump has got the attention of Europe in a way that his predecessors did not. Trump's disruptiveness is another trope, an overused but under-examined term. In fact, continuity has been as evident as change in his administration's foreign policy. The long arc of American foreign policy has probably seen as much or more preference for unilateralism and bilateralism as multilateralism. Obama was probably the exception in his commitment to multilateralism. And in some respects, for example, dealing with North Korea and in the South China Sea, as examples, Trump's approach marks a return to an old policy of peace through strength. Trump's abandonment of the TPP was certainly a blow to American credibility. But Obama's failure to enforce the red line he drew in Syria over the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons was no less a blow. And when Trump bombed Syria over the same issue while at dinner with Xi Jinping, he did much to restore the credibility of American power. Trump's foreign policy has so often been criticized as a retreat from leadership that is taken as almost axiomatic by some. But this is a caricature. His administration's national security strategy of 2017 and its national defense strategy of 2018 both make clear his administration's intention to compete robustly with China and Russia, which he labels strategic competitors. These documents and his administration's actions represent a narrower and less generous concept of American leadership. And one may take issue with the concept, but it cannot be accurately described as a retreat. If you say, I'm going to compete, how can you say that it's a retreat? Criticism of Trump is often more a reflection of the traditional foreign policy establishment's chagrin at Trump's failure to embrace what they consider American values than it is an accurate description of his policies. What the foreign policy establishment failed to recognize, and I think still does not sufficiently recognize, is that substantial numbers of ordinary Americans do not accept the establishment's values as authentically American. Trump was, after all, elected over Hillary Clinton, the exemplar of the establishment. There have always been more than one set of American values. That is a dirty little secret that my American friends refuse to acknowledge in public, because the shining city on the hill has always had a dark side. But those alternative values were largely ignored until they found voice and agency in Trump and could be ignored no longer. Soon after he was elected in 2016, Trump took a telephone call from Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen. The New York Times criticized this for risking the One China policy. But when he reaffirmed the One China policy a few months later, the New York Times described this as weakness and a retreat. Before Trump met Kim Jong-un in Vietnam in February this year, the foreign policy establishment worried that inadequate preparation would allow North Korea to manipulate the US into giving away too much. But when Trump walked away from the meeting rather than conclude an unsatisfactory deal, the meeting was called a failure. The inconsistencies reveal far more about the psychological state of Mr. Trump's critics than Mr. Trump's policies. Now, this is not to say that there is nothing to criticize. When Xi Jinping delivers one of his eloquent defenses of globalization, he is implicitly making the same point as when the American establishment or Europeans denounced Trump as a threat to the liberal international order. And that basic point is anxiety about what it means for their own countries now that America is no longer prepared to be as open or as generous as before. And this is a valid concern. The resulting uncertainties affect all countries, China included. China was the main beneficiary of the American-led post-Cold War globalization. China may well be the main loser if that order should further fray, because the US now embraces a narrow concept of leadership. Can the Belt and Road Initiative succeed if the world turns protectionist as a result of the trade war? I don't think so. More to the point, I don't think the Chinese think so either. Trump is not an aberration that will pass with the next administration. Key elements of his foreign policy, in particular the tougher approach towards China as a strategic competitor, enjoys strong bipartisan support across many policy domains. It was Bush 43, the younger Bush, that almost 20 years ago who first labeled China a strategic competitor. But of course, the Bush 43 administration got distracted by 9/11 and became mired in the desert sands of the Middle East, giving China an almost free hand to pursue its own interests. A focus on China was also the intention of Obama's pivot or rebalance to Asia. But Obama had little stomach for competition. He talked tough but acted weak. In fact, the one thing that I have found that unites countries, when you talk to their diplomats privately, not for the record, China accepted and Iran accepted. China accepted in Asia, Iran accepted in the Middle East. All of them agreed Obama was quite a disaster. There has been a paradigm shift in the US approach to China that any successor to Trump will find difficult to reverse without being accused of being soft. Of particular importance is the souring of the attitude of American businesses over forced technology transfers and theft of intellectual property. Disillusionment with China had been growing since the Bush 43 administration. American business may not always agree with Trump's methods, but I see no significant disagreement with his goals. American business had been the stabilizing factor in US-China relations, and its political influence is not to be underestimated. As Calvin Coolidge famously quipped, the business of America is business. Trump's successor may speak more prudently and act more predictably, but the probability is that whoever succeeds Trump will represent the same political phenomenon and pursue much the same policies, at least towards China. And don't forget, Trump's successor may well be Trump. as I see it, the 2020 election is his to lose. Decoupling the US and its allies from China at any acceptable cost is not going to work and is probably not a serious objective. But there has nevertheless been a real change of attitude. From 1972 to around 2009, despite the inevitability of competition between major powers, the overall emphasis of US-China relations was on engagement. The balance of the relationship has now flipped. War is highly improbable, nuclear deterrence impels caution, engagement will not cease, the US and China will still cooperate when their interests coincide, but for the foreseeable future, the center of gravity of US-China relations will now be on strategic competition, undertaken in the context of an increasingly complex international environment. China's rise must be seen in the context of the gradual re-emergence of a more multipolar world, after the historically brief and exceptional period of unchallenged American preeminence. Multipolarity is still asymmetrical, with the US at the apex of most indices of global power. But multipolarity is already a reality at the regional level. One reason for the re-emergence of multipolarity is the ambivalence of major power relationships that I mentioned earlier. Multipolarity is a consequence of every major power hedging and balancing simultaneously as a response to ambivalence in the relationships. And it's not as if the only alternative to an American world is a Chinese world. The US will not suddenly disappear, nor will Europe, Russia, Japan, India, among others, vanish. They are all still and will remain substantive global players, although not on the same scale as the US and China. But the paradox and the challenge of our times, and the fundamental cause of the uncertainties that we all now face, is that the evolving multipolar world still rests on a foundation of institutions, norms, and practices established by a very different concept of American leadership than now prevails. China is not an alternative to American leadership. China can supplement but not substitute for American leadership. This is because an open global order cannot be led on the basis of a still largely closed and mercantilist Chinese model. China's growth, by the way, don't forget, rests on that open international order. There may be or may not be a trade deal. I don't know, but I would guess on some kind of deal. But even if there's a deal, the likelihood is that it will be a partial deal and a temporary deal, a truce, not peace. China will find it difficult to regain trust of American business and hence of American policymakers for a very obvious reason. So obvious as to be often overlooked. China is, after all, a communist country, one of 5 remaining in the world. It's not communist in ideology, but in the structure of its political system. And this is a Leninist system in which a dominant party insists on unchallenged control over all sectors of society and the absolute right to direct all sectors of society in the interests of the party. And this is the root cause of the unfair practices that are the subject of Western complaints. Whatever other compromises China may be prepared to make, it will not and cannot compromise on party control. Therefore, tensions over trade and technology transfers will sooner or later resurface. The 18th Party Congress, 18th Chinese Communist Party Congress in 2012, had acknowledged that the Chinese model that led to the spectacular growth of the 1990s was not sustainable over the long term. The 18th Party Congress and its subsequent plenum in 2013 recognized that a new normal of slower but still respectable growth would over the long term have to depend on enhanced market efficiencies in key sectors. This posed a fundamental, perhaps even existential question for China. A bigger role for the market implies a loosening of control. But how can the market be given a greater role without risk to the rule of the Chinese Communist Party? There is no practical alternative to Chinese Communist Party rule for China. And by the time of the 19th Party Congress in 2017, there was still no clear answer to how and how much more China should open up. Very little of the agenda set out at the plenum in 2013 has actually been implemented. It remains to be seen how Xi Jinping will deal with this. He will have to manage many contradictory considerations. For now, he has clearly opted for more control. Now, most commentary on Xi Jinping's speech at the 19th Party Congress in 2017 focused on China's global ambitions, of which the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, was the centerpiece. And since October 2017, the BRI has been incorporated into the Chinese Communist Party's constitution, which makes clear that this is a long-term goal that will not be lightly abandoned. There is nothing unusual about a big country having big ambitions. And the BRI is nothing if not an ambitious vision of China's future global role. But ambition and vision do not in themselves a strategy make or guarantee success. Most of the commentary missed the real point of Xi's speech to the 19th Party Congress, whose primary focus was domestic. Insufficient attention was given to Xi Jinping's redefinition of the new principal contradiction facing China. And this was the contradiction between China's, and I quote from his speech, between China's unbalanced and inadequate development and the people's ever-growing needs for a better life, end of quote. And consequently on the need to revitalize the Chinese Communist Party and strengthen its control in order to deal with the challenges. It was clear that Xi believed that the success of, indeed the continuation of, party rule depended on the Chinese Communist Party being able to fulfill the people's expectations. Now, the new principal contradiction prescribes a lengthy economic, social, and political agenda for China. Among other things, this domestic agenda includes, and I've taken this list from the speech, moving industry up the value chain, cutting overcapacity, promoting innovation, dealing with debt, the environment, revitalizing the rural sector, promoting balanced regional growth, an aging population, and thus healthcare and social security, promoting social mobility, improving education, housing, food safety, corruption, diffusing social tensions, and expanding what Xi called, and I quote again, orderly political participation. Now, each of these items is complicated enough, and dealing with all poses even more complicated domestic policy challenges. Among other things, how should these items be sequenced? What trade-offs will be necessary? Which provinces should be prioritized? What institutional changes, if any, will be necessary? And dealing with this agenda will take a long time. How long, no one knows for sure, and require immense resources. We shouldn't forget that China's resources, while vast, are not infinite or inexhaustible. Continually replenishing resources on the scale needed to deal with that agenda requires continued growth. But sustaining growth requires a new model. And at the same time, Mr. Xi's insistence on stronger party control has sharpened the fundamental challenge of finding a new balance between party control and economic efficiency. Now, the Belt and Road Initiative attempts to finesse the challenge of finding a new balance by externalizing and exporting the Chinese growth model based on heavy reliance on state-owned enterprise-led infrastructure investment supported by Chinese labor, Chinese materials, and Chinese capitals, by exporting the Chinese growth model that the 18th Party Congress had already recognized 7 years ago was unsustainable within China. So the BRI buys time to find a new balance between the market and party control, but does not in itself prescribe the new balance or a new sustainable model. There is growing awareness in countries as diverse as Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Sierra Leone, and Pakistan, among others, that the externalization of China's internal challenges, which is what the BRI essentially is, to my mind, is not without liabilities. For recipient countries, these liabilities are not just the so-called debt trap, on which too much emphasis has been placed, in my view, because those that fall into the debt trap are generally corrupt. And if you are not corrupt, you will not be trapped. And I don't think it's a deliberate instrument of Chinese foreign policy. But what is more complicated is the domestic political complications that arise from what I think is a certain Chinese cultural altruism that disregards or is unaware of local sensitivities when implementing BRI projects. Examples are available on request during question time. There are just too many examples. This speech will take all night if I... Now, nobody is going to shun Chinese investment. That would be stupid. There is undoubtedly a greater need for infrastructure investment in many countries than existing international or private financial institutions are prepared to fund. But greater caution by BRI recipient countries, and in some cases outright pushback, has become evident. There is growing awareness of the liabilities within China itself. There is muted but nevertheless clear questioning within China about the wisdom of prematurely abandoning Deng Xiaoping's approach of hiding light and biding time, and about expending, some would say squandering, resources on BRI projects whose viability is not always obvious at a time when China's own internal needs are so compelling. Some projects seem to have been undertaken because of a desire to please the leadership or to get capital out of China rather than from a robust process of due diligence and evaluation. None of this threatens Xi's position. None of this implies that China will fail. In fact, I don't think China will fail entirely. But neither can Xi ignore the criticism or the external pushback. There has been an effort to tone down the articulation of China's ambitions to avoid further provoking the US or scaring the recipients of BRI projects. Chinese officials have themselves acknowledged that the implementation of the BRI has not been smooth. Some BRI projects will work better than others, some will stall, and some will have to be renegotiated, as is already happening. Now, what are the long-term prospects for US-China strategic competition? It cannot be denied that China's Leninist system is better placed than the US system to pursue long-term goals. Political dysfunctionality makes it difficult for the American system to deal with many urgent problems. Still, do not forget that the most significant things about America do not necessarily happen in Washington, D.C. What happens in American universities, American research laboratories, major American corporations on Wall Street and in the 50 states of the Union may be of far greater long-term consequence than what happens in Washington, D.C. And China's system is not without its own vulnerabilities. Xi's concentration of power, his abandonment of term limits, and the principle of collective leadership have been compared to Mao Zedong. I think the comparison is false. Mao was a romantic revolutionary. He thrived on chaos, and when there was too much order, he created his own chaos, as in the Cultural Revolution. Mr. Xi is, if anything, far too orderly, hence his almost obsession with control. So the comparison is false, but something akin to a neo-Maoist single point of failure may have been reintroduced into the Chinese system. By a single point of failure, I mean if every decision has to go to one point, and Mr. Xi, don't forget, is the chairman of almost every leading small group on any issue that you can think of, and the leading small group, the party leading small group are the real decision-making bodies. The power of ministries, the state apparatus to make decisions, is real, but it's limited. The decision-making is in the party. So that's what I mean by a single point of failure. One bad decision can have far-reaching consequences. And China is an inexperienced global player. The BRI takes China into some of the most geopolitically complex regions of the world, and Beijing's navigation of the complexities has often been clumsy. China will learn, of course, but some of its mistakes have been so egregious that I can only attribute them to that single point of failure and the resulting echo chamber effect, which degrades China's ability to adapt and learn. Let me give you an example of the echo chamber effect. As an example close to home. On 18 December 2017, the Chinese embassy in Singapore held a roundtable for a visiting Chinese dignitary who was interested in building stronger public support in Singapore for bilateral relations with China. Now, there's nothing unusual about any embassy doing so. When I was running an embassy, I did it all the time for people coming from Singapore. Not just dignitaries, academics, people, officials, anybody. What was unusual about the 18 December event was that only Chinese Singaporeans and PRC Chinese were invited to participate. The most senior Singaporean present described Singapore as a fundamentally Chinese society. The other participants did not take issue with this characterization of Singapore and seemed to accept it as a given. They only asked Chinese officials to refrain from using terms like the United Front strategy because this was extremely sensitive for ethnic Chinese communities in Southeast Asia. But there was one exception. A young Singapore academic who had somehow slipped through the embassy screening process pointed out that Singapore was not a fundamentally Chinese society, but a multiracial and multicultural society. The academic questioned why Singaporeans of other ethnicities were not invited to make the group more representative, pointing out that while China often exhorted Singaporeans to understand Chinese policies, understanding ought to be mutual, and China should understand Singapore's geopolitical situation and be sensitive to our concerns as well. For doing so, this young academic was subsequently taken to task by a member of the Chinese embassy for being a troublemaker. Now, the reason is not hard to understand. Xi Jinping had for some time blurred the distinction between the Huaren, which is ethnic Chinese or whatever citizenship, and Huaqiao, PRC citizens. And the embassy was clearly reluctant to have the visiting dignitary listen to discordant views, lest it be accused of being insufficiently enthusiastic in its support for Xi's policies. I will return to China's handling of the overseas Chinese in my last lecture. For now, suffice to note that it seems clear that the embassy's intention in holding the roundtable was to reinforce existing official views and not to expose the dignitary to a more balanced understanding of Singapore. I do not think that this is an isolated incident peculiar to Singapore. In fact, I know it is not because I've heard people tell me similar stories in various other countries, in Southeast Asia and further away. Now, creating echo chambers can have policy consequences that are not in China's own interests. How else to explain the behavior of the Chinese ambassador to Malaysia during the 2018 general election, during which the ambassador openly campaigned for the president of the Malaysian Chinese Association? Now, this was so wrong in so many dimensions that I find it very difficult to know when to begin to enumerate the mistakes. So just take my word for it. It is the most stupid thing I've ever known any diplomat of any country. And believe me, I've known many stupid diplomats from many countries to have done. And I've been dealing with them for almost 37 years. This is absolutely the most stupid thing. Now, okay, Singapore and Malaysia may not be of great consequence in the overall order of Chinese foreign policy. But the echo chamber effect can have more significant strategic consequences. China was clearly caught on the back foot by Trump's trade war, despite the fact, as I mentioned earlier, that the disenchantment of American businesses with China had been growing for almost 20 years. I got a glimpse of why this may have been so when I visited the US in March 2017. Vice Premier Liu He was in the US for talks. Sorry, was it 2017? Yeah, 2017. Vice Premier Liu He was in the US for talks with Trump. I had called on a friend who heads a major American corporation and is a member of the US-China Business Council, which is a very influential organization. My friend told me that he and some colleagues from the Business Council, had just met Liu He a couple of days before I went to see him. Of course, I asked him what they had told him. Right? What was his reply? We told Liu He that it is all of us and not just Trump, my friend said. I was a little bit taken aback. Surely he already knew this. I commented, after all, Liu He is China's most senior Chinese expert on trade with the US. But my friend replied, he didn't seem to know. Now, I know the Chinese ambassador to the US personally. I've worked with him in my previous life. The Chinese ambassador to the US is an experienced diplomat, indeed one of the most able diplomats of any country I have met. He could not have been unaware of the change in the attitude of American business. And there was no reason for my friend to misrepresent Liu He's reaction to what the Business Council told him. But given Xi's concentration of power and the severe penalties for getting on Xi's wrong side, there is good reason to wonder what exactly had been reported upwards in the Chinese system and in what form information today reaches the top leadership. It's not unknown in any bureaucratic structure to polish assessments and information so as to avoid giving offense. I can't say that the Singapore system is free of this syndrome either. But this is a matter of degree is important, and I kind of suspect that in the Chinese system, things are polished to such high gloss that they rather blind the recipients of that information. China made two unforced errors in dealing with the Trump administration. First, after the global financial crisis, Beijing seemed to have begun to believe its own propaganda about China's unstoppable rise and America's inevitable and absolute decline, and overestimated its own capabilities. That is actually the burden of some of the internal criticism that Xi is facing. And towards the end of the Hu Jintao administration, a new assertiveness of tone and action began to infuse Chinese foreign policy, which was enhanced when Xi took command. Hubris is not an American monopoly. Second, China may have overgeneralized its experience of Obama's reluctance to compete and mistook the particularities of one administration for a new norm of American foreign policy. And China is still trying to recover from these mistakes. The trade war pulls policy in contradictory directions, seriously complicating the effort to deal with the domestic agenda set out by the new principal contradiction. There was some initial bluster, but China has since been quite conciliatory towards Trump on trade. There has also been an effort to at least improve the atmospherics of relations with Japan, India, South Korea, and ASEAN, to some degree Australia too, to avoid having to simultaneously deal with problems on multiple fronts. Question arises, is this a new approach, or only a tactical adjustment? I tend towards the latter view. Since it is unlikely that a conciliatory approach will be rewarded by anything more than a temporary respite from American pressures, particularly on technology, Xi cannot be indefinitely conciliatory without being accused of weakness. Remember, he's already facing some degree of criticism internally. The nationalism that Xi has used far more insistently than his predecessors to legitimate Chinese Communist Party rule, and which the Chinese Communist Party fears even as it uses, will demand a reckoning. The probability is that sooner or later, Xi will have to act tough again. What Mr. Xi will eventually have to do in order to protect his position is a question that cannot be answered at present, but one that bears close monitoring. His response may not be economic. Observers have recently noted that Chinese diplomacy has of late become more bumptious than seems absolutely necessary. I'm a bit surprised these commentators only just noticed. Anybody who has dealt with them could tell them that the bumptiousness started something like around 2010. Again, examples on request. Now, contemporary China is a curious mixture of extreme external confidence and deep internal insecurity. Both are equally valid aspects of China, which cannot be understood unless both aspects are taken into account. The combination of confidence and insecurity accounts for much of the suboptimality in its foreign policy that I've tried to briefly sketch, amplified, of course, by the personal insecurities of cadres arising from the anti-corruption campaign. And this is particularly true in the foreign ministry, which is not very high on the Chinese bureaucratic totem pole. Governing a huge country like China will never be easy, and insecurity is perhaps understandable since China is in the midst of a social and economic transformation with all their attendant dislocations that is historically unprecedented in its rapidity and its scale. I have nevertheless always been puzzled by the extent of the Chinese Communist Party's insecurity. After all, the party's control over society, backed up in extremis by the People's Liberation Army, has never been weak and has been strengthened under siege. The vast majority of the Chinese people have experienced real improvements in their lives and are not against the system. The Chinese Communist Party's China is not going to collapse, as some of China's more extreme critics have repeatedly predicted. Gordon Chang comes to mind. I think it has been almost 20 years where he has predicted China will collapse next year. Every year is next year. The Chinese Communist Party's persistent insecurity may have deeper causes than the inevitable churn of a society in rapid transformation. There is a gentleman that I don't know how many of you have heard of, and I must admit I only stumbled on him, called Fei Xiaotong. Fei Xiaotong is a Western-trained sociologist who returned to China after 1949. He was rusticated during the Cultural Revolution but rehabilitated after Mao's death. His masterwork, his magnus opus, is a book entitled From the Soil, The Foundations of Chinese Society. This book argues that rather than the state per se, China is held together by, I quote, elastic networks of relationships between individuals. Now, if A's analysis of the deep structure of Chinese society is correct, there is nothing more antithetical to a Leninist state and may account for the factionalism that has plagued CCP politics, and maybe insecurity is a structural feature of the governance of China. A Leninist state is one that demands control and puts in place institutions to control. But if he is right, and the real structure, the deep structure, is elastic networks of individuals, then that accounts for something, the insecurity as well as the factionalism that has always plagued Chinese Communist Party politics. So if insecurity is a structural feature of the governance of China, it will persist over the long term, no matter what the degree of control or how well China's economy does. And so the new balance between control and economic efficiency that I had identified as the chief obstacle to the next phase of reform may prove elusive. Now, my last point may strike some of you as speculative, and it is speculative, and I offer it only as a speculation. But awareness of all these complications and complexities, speculative as well as actual, offers a more nuanced and qualified understanding of the trope of China's rise than the simplistic and straightforward narrative too often presented by officials, intellectuals of a certain ilk, or the media. I will explain in my next and last lecture why a nuanced understanding of the trope is important for Singapore. Thank you for listening to me.